Good afternoon. It is just after 4 o'clock. It's 4:02 p.m. on Tuesday, March 12th. This is a policy committee meeting of West Bend Joint School District. Just to confirm, Superintendent Wimmer, this meeting was properly posted.
Yes, it was.
Fantastic. Let's start with Pledge of Allegiance, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Perfect.
Thank you.
All
All
right.
right.
And just in right the spot of time, so just announcing that we have a quorum of our committee present, and we have school board members John Donaldson, I'm Chris Weigert, Chad Temez, and then Superintendent Wimmer is with us as well. So why don't we
Kick it on over.
kick it on over? Superintendent Wimmer.
All right, so we have a few policies for update tonight, and then we'll do a review of the 400 series. So recall that Mr. Harder, who oversees facilities and technology, had been scouting some language. We've had some preliminary conversations related to metal detector use, honing in on some of those samples, and then just mocked up some sample language to continue our discussion. And even Tim and I were talking too around the nuance between a wand versus metal detection and all of those pieces, and what we would do. So there's just some draft language to get us started. One of the pieces that we talked about was when we look at policy, then there's a intersection with search. So if we do some pieces here, we might need to, later in the 400 series is a search policy. We might need to intersect those. And then also too, we had talked about in the beginning having then not just the policy which authorizes that, but then some kind of guidance language, and that would serve as these are our process and practice related to using those. So I'll let Tim kind of take it from there on that draft language.
But so the language in front of you is really developed out of a combination of multiple policies to allow us to do metal detection used for security screening for the entry to a school building, a school athletic event, a school-sponsored event, a dance, whatever else, or a individual search of a student or somebody on premise. And so that's where you heard Ms. Wimmer talk about the fact of, a metal detection wand versus a metal detection device, trying to cover both of that in one policy, because it is very different of, everybody line up and go through the metal detector for security screening versus, oh, I'm worried that Ms. Wimmer has something on her and we're going to screen her individually. And so thus you see the two kind of different categories there. We start out the policy about the authorization piece, where we're going to notify people, and then she talked about the idea of a procedural manual. This would be what we would train our staff on here for. And so it would be anybody who would be event staff of what this would look like. It would outline all of those different pieces of how you would set that up, along to individual searches and so forth. The one thing that we did see referenced in multiple policies is when you get down to that more individual search, the ability for the person to request that they are scanned or searched by somebody of the same gender. It's done in a private room. The notification pieces and who is authorized for that. In many cases, policies relating to the individual student search are only allowing administration or administrators to make that search. No other staff, where obviously we're not going to have enough administrators to do security screening, so that would be a wide variety of staff who would get trained on that, but this would be a regular training that our staff would have to go through, along with a review of that policy procedure on a regular basis by this group if we needed to change. So this is a combination of 3 of the policies that we had talked about last time to try to find that balance of what we were all talking about.
Hey Tim, would you be able to log me?
We can go to the office.
I think we've got a terminal that isn't feeling well today.
I put in everything correct.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah, I may not recognize that one. Now you'll be able to go Word docs on that one.
okay. Thank you.
So Tim, just a follow-up question. I think you addressed it, but you didn't hear it correctly. So as it relates, I can imagine with a policy like this, which is kind of the overarching, like you said in the beginning, school board gives permission, here's how notice is going to be handled, but then there's going to be a whole bunch of particular policies and procedures around, like you were saying, what happens if someone would like someone of the same gender to perform the security suite. I can imagine that, that could be voluminous. So between that handbook and then the overall policy, that handbook may change from time to time.
Yes.
Practices change.
Yes.
So is the idea that we'd have the overarching policy, that administration would have a handbook, or that the handbook would be something that the policy committee would come back with?
So,
I guess I'm
yep.
open to either, I just want to hear your thoughts.
So in the policy, it actually talks about it coming back on an annual review, or if we were to make changes. And so that policy manual could cover everything from, here's an example or best practice layout. You are gonna see things listed in the policy that are very specific about, oh, I searched Mr. Zyger with the wand, it alerted, even though I asked him. We're gonna do it a second time. We are going to make sure that if we do randomized selections, in the policy, it says the only option for that is every third, every fourth, every fifth, and it stays that way so that, Ms. Wimmer can't say, well, they called me out, right? We saw
Yeah.
that in multiple policies around discrimination and so forth, but that procedural manual could get lengthy, and so if you remember, the Madison policy was like 13 pages, trying to find the balance of what's appropriate for a policy versus that manual, but that would come back, and we would update the committee at minimum, and the board through our normal newsletters to discuss that yearly of what's working and what's not.
So that, again, that checks and balances, that this would be an annual review regardless. So certainly any changes would have to come through policy on those pieces, that guidebook that's in relation to this policy, but we also put it as just an automatic one on the annual list regardless, just so that it's always in attention. And then when we report to the full board on what the work is, it also brings it to the attention of the full board too, so.
And our hope would be that the policy, it's hard to outline every single specific use of a metal detection device. So that's why you have the two big ones out there are the security screening and the individual search at that point in time. And so that's why you do see the delineated two groups is we may never ever use the mass security screening one, but we obviously have talked about
Yeah.
uses for the individual search right away. But because we're bringing a policy forward, if we write that, if we had an immediate need, we don't have to come to the board and talk about it. We have rules in play that if we had to set that up for an event, we could do that, bar and be able to get the equipment and all of that at the same time.
And again, if something, this is just a kind of that authorization and that awareness that those things may be used, but if certainly some kind of event came to be, some potential, I would just notice the board and we would put in safety measures alongside law enforcement, et cetera, if we ran into something. So recall, I think the time that we were talking about this, there was an episode at a school in Wisconsin where they made a decision to cancel spectators at a game versus maybe some security measures in that. And again, I don't begrudge them that decision or having to do that. Nothing bars me from, if I see a need, to pursuing collaboration with law enforcement. It doesn't box us into that. I think then for tonight, because we had talked about an umbrella, is the amount of this being an umbrella, and then we could mock up that kind of guidance document to go with it and accompany it? Or is there something that like, hey, it needs to be in kind of the front-facing policy part? And we can always post that guideline document right with the policy. But do we have enough to kind of keep advancing things forward?
I have additional thoughts, but I don't want to stop my fellow members. Any questions? Okay. My general thought is we want to make this certainly overarching and that broad grant of authority. I feel like this is a very important issue, but in a good way, the devil's in the details. And so the more general and overarching we can keep the policy, and the more specific we can keep the manual, especially so that it's a good training mechanism as well. I think that the idea that we generally put our public on notice that this board is authorizing, generally speaking, these types of security measures, I want to say is sufficient for most of the public. The whole idea of whether we're going to search randomly or every second or third or it's well important is fine in a detailed manual, I think. Both would be subject though to public disclosure, correct?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think the idea being that manual would be the training piece, but very specific. So the one thing that we learned through the research of this is you don't want, if all 5 of us were gonna run a security screening event, it should all run the same so that there's no, Chris picked him out for this reason or whatever else. you want it to be very consistent, and depending upon what we're doing in a security screening event, you talk about a lot of people or little people, and we wanna make sure that, you know, numbers-wise, we're able to handle all of this and it's determined ahead of time, so that will be very prescribed. The how-to manual down to the what happens if I go through it the second time and all of those details, that will fit in that piece where you could even have that on hand for the employee to check at that point in the middle of that event.
So if we would go with that approach, what would be next step? Would it be the
We would
construction
bring-
plan?
Yep, we would start the manual piece. If you guys are good with this right here, we would actually bring that manual piece back, and then bring that forward with the hopes that we could have this in play, for next school year. At that point would be our target date.
What we could do certainly is, as we develop that manual, kind of bring it forward to the full board for some interim feedback around it, so that we're just tightening up and then we're ready to go with both policy and practice together. So we're keeping that workflow going.
I think that's a good place to start, and obviously we can continue to have feedback on it as we go forward. Chad?
Yeah, I think the bones of the policy look pretty good. I think that the detailed manual and what the training will look like and things like that, as you continue to develop that, as long as there's a pathway to bring that back for review and stuff, and I think it's a good place to start and let you guys start, you know, finding a process, finding a policy that will cover a process that is practical to implement.
Yep.
Say that 3 times.
Right.
Great, then that will be our path forward on that. Any other questions or direction? Then we will proceed and we'll make sure to update the board. Thank you for all your work.
Yes.
Now,
Thank
see,
you.
those
Thank you.
30
I appreciate
pages
it.
from Madison are gonna be put to use.
They are, well, and some of it is
There's some
that,
good
that
stuff.
is the balance of, it's very prescribed in their policy versus that manual, but now we can even include, you know, if we were to do security screen, we can have layouts and pictures and all of that, so I think that'll be a good balance. So thank you for the feedback and the continued ideas on this.
Thank you for your work.
Yes. The next item was foreshadowed as part of the audit. Our auditors recommended updates to our policy 660, financial management and internal controls. You can see in the mock-up there, it's generally the addition of AM State in addition to federal awards, how that's managed. So it's that expansion as well as some new couple pieces in the green.
So I took a look at that, I had no concerns, this is really adding requirements, which,
Right, that
Which
we're subject to anyway.
right,
But the auditor felt it would be a good artifact and to revise our existing policy, so we'll keep moving that
No
forward if
concerns here.
there's no question or comment. Great. The next is an interesting one, it's policy 346 is around testing, but there's an exhibit, the testing opt-out form. So I'm just showing you that we're updating this form and I want to have a conversation around exhibits. So the change in that form is, recall that we shifted the assessment program, so instead of the ACT Aspire, which is in the 2020 version, we've moved to the pre-ACT Secure, which is grades 9 and 10. So it's calling out the appropriate test name and then the corresponding checkbox for any family who would like to opt out of district testing.
Are there a list of acceptable reasons to opt out, or can you opt out for no reason?
For no reason other than parent choice, that's acceptable
Okay.
per statute.
sorry, just so I see this, because I'm looking at the two, can you put it up one more time?
Yep,
Thank you.
so, nope, it's the difference between the ACT Aspire, which was replaced with the
Ah.
pre-ACT Secure.
I see, I was looking at the check boxes.
And then,
I
yep, and then
understand.
the checkbox, so ACT Aspire is gone and it's pre-ACT
I see.
Secure, yeah.
Instead of the reason for opt-out with the text box, could we just put reason for opt-out and have a box that says parental choice and another one that said other?
If they did that, yeah, you could, but generally, even, we follow up with everyone who submits one. So even if it's parental choice, we're asking for a little bit, and then we follow up with them. A lot of times, there might be some misunderstanding or some things like that, or we're just navigating what their wishes are for testing, so that we document that. But it's generally a follow-up conversation.
So even if they would leave that reason for opt-out box blank.
Correct, we're still following up,
Okay.
yeah.
Any questions or objections to that one? Looks pretty straightforward.
No, it's very straightforward. I have a procedural question for the committee. So if you look at our policy on making policies, so.
Policy on policies.
Exact, which there is one,
Yeah.
as well as a style guide. It does not mention exhibits. It talks about your policy and the exact process, and then it delegates authority around ARs, the administrative rules to administration. So as we've cleaned up all of our policy, we've still alerted at the committee level, like, hey, we're making this change. It's, revised because of our policy revision or the update. So we've done that work. But it is silent on exhibits. Exhibits are generally forms. They update quite continuously, things of that nature. Are you okay with just us alerting the board if we've changed an exhibit with a policy? Do you want me to revisit the policy on making policies so that we call that out? I see this as even, it's underneath an administrative rule, it's just an exhibit, but I just want to make sure that procedurally
And, as it relates to setting the policies, the form itself does not create the policy.
Correct.
That more is a description of how it's executed, which is really akin to an administrative rule.
Yeah, and it's also just trying to make the package of the information community or family friendly. So, hey, do I have the right to opt out? I sure do, and hey, here's the form right here with
It's right
it.
there.
You can see examples of the attendance letter. Here's a sample attendance letter. Here's a sample of this. It's just meant to help provide information. And again, it would have to be in alignment with, but if you're comfortable with that, I would like to just proceed with that. As we change forms, I can certainly put it in a board update alerting to the change, but.
John?
I think I would appreciate just the update of letting us know, hey, we changed this, but essentially it's no different than, permission slip to go on a field trip.
Exactly.
So, every time you make an update on that, you're not sending it to us to review, so.
Well, we appreciate that, and then we'll just make sure to inform the board as things are updated, and we'll update that form right away. Again, that doesn't need to be acted on or anything, just alerting you, and then we'll make that change on the website and make sure families have that updated form. Great.
Right.
The next one, recall that we have a policy on our docket now, and it's got a reference in it to this policy. You can see in the strike-through policy around complaints, concerns, 872, we're looking at a more 870 policy. Although some of the pieces were those in policy references versus an out of policy reference. So we would recommend taking those numbers out. And then in there, you've got your preamble that you read as the board president. So I was just talking about consider moving that to an AR, so it's a little bit more flexible. What if you needed to change that announcement one night? I was looking at those pieces. So cleaning up the policy references as well as consideration for that preamble is kind of what I was thinking as I reviewed.
Yeah, I would like to suggest that we move the board president. I would like to leave that there is potentially in the policy, that there's a board president's announcement like to be read.
Oh, yeah.
Like just word that as board president announcement to be read according to updated AR.
Yes.
And then have the actual wording as an AR, so that it can be
I think that's
more
perfect.
flexible. Because, it could be something as silly as having the comment cards not by the entrance, maybe we
Right.
change the layout and they're over here or something, whatever.
Exactly.
So, as long as there's something that just says board president shall read announcement according to updated AR, or something like that, and then that's it.
I'm okay with that.
And then I think it's more nimble to actually, when you're saying it, cite the actual policy numbers that's in reference to, instead of baking it into the policy where we have to change it and all of that. So that I would restore then it's, as soon as we update that policy number, I would restore that in the preamble. It's these numbers exactly, here's this, because it's an AR.
Mhm. Makes sense. I mean, it accomplishes the same purpose. I have to admit, there are times when, so we have some individuals that avail themselves of public participation from time to time, and on the one hand, are very familiar with this. On the other hand, sometimes members of the viewing audience are not. Sometimes I struggle with, wow, do we need to read this? But I think the better approach is, this is what we should do, and meeting to meeting, if we decide we want to waive it, the board can, decide it, but otherwise, let's put it into an AR.
Perfect.
And simplify the policy that way, but then the content is still there.
Great, I'll add that line, shift that, and then when I create the AR, I'll still bring that with it when we advance the policy change, so people can see it, and then I'll update those numbers automatically for it.
Great.
Perfect. The next was the 400 series, so I just want to give you an overview. This is a relatively up-to-date series. All of the pieces have been taken care of in the last year, really. There was a slate, quite a slate of them that were handled in February of 2023 and then April of 2023. This was all of that comprehensive behavior work that was done with the assistant principals and principals that set the foundation for us. We added several policies in that. So in looking at those cross-referencing, there's been no updates to laws or recommendations from WASB on those. But do we want to just take them by chunk to see if you've got any questions on those? Otherwise, I've got a few that I want to call attention to.
That would be my suggestion, is
Great.
if there's any that have been put into play, have been used, or questions since the last time they were updated, I think we should address those.
Yep.
Sure.
So that first one on that list would be 432, the school attendance area. Nothing out of alignment right now, but as we explore configuration of our schools, it is very specific to the grade levels on there. So I could generalize that language instead of locking us into those grade levels because it calls out K through this is this, and I can speak more generally. Just putting that on the radar. So there's nothing to change right now. It's just something to monitor as we look at those. So if you'd like me to mock up something generalized that we could use around that in advance, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, as we look at configuration, just know that this should come with that.
Part of me thinks that if you were to give us a draft in advance, because we've not made any decisions on this one way or the other,
Right.
so as it relates to what facilities look like in the future, et cetera. My point is, I think if we would take a look at this more generally, so it doesn't have the unanticipated appearance of we're crafting this to meet some sort of agenda, which we do not have.
Yep.
I think it makes sense to work on at least the draft sooner. That's my thought, but I'd certainly.
And you would just generalize to the elementary level. What grades are in it then are just generalized. So, you can look at those pieces or each school. So I can mock up something generalized for the team's review.
Yeah, my suggestion would be, when we amend or change the policy, have it by grade level, not by school, like you're suggesting. That way. It won't matter whether,
Right, what building?
Yeah, because right now it's got specific building names, and obviously as those shift, we might have to change that.
So I'll just make them more generalized around how school attendance is, because it's the intersection of we have attendance boundaries and we allow families to choice in and out of those boundaries. So there's an intersection of some choice policies. So this is just declaring there is a school attendance area. But again, it does not need to be this specific. So I will take a stab at generalizing that for our team then. The next policy, again, Tim and I will look at, we'll lay out that guidebook, is 446 student search activities. So we'll look to see if we should expand something that includes the potential for metal detection in the policy language, or if we just cross-reference. Do you have any kind of immediate, you'd like to see it stated in the language, or just cross-reference the policy when it's developed? Any reaction to that?
So let's explore that briefly. So if we would say, we would like metal detection to be in here, that would be a separate paragraph.
Well, if you want to put in the potential for, it's talking about kind of the primary areas that we can search, which is, but we also call out in here that we use canine searches. So I can also just under that point put in something that metal detection may be used as well, and it can be a one-off statement in there, in that language.
Yeah. I wouldn't be opposed to that. Part of me thinks that as we more fully explore metal detection, that first we should get that done before, otherwise, I don't want to say we're shooting in the dark.
Yeah.
But I think we're optimistic that we will be adding something like that.
I'm sure we're not the only school, so I'll also get a little guidance on, do they recommend we put it in there? I'll get some of the legal recommendations too.
Go ahead, John, please.
Well, we have officers at the school that have metal detectors.
Correct.
So currently, we can potentially do it now.
Absolutely.
But I would say if we're gonna add it in, I wouldn't do it under the canine, I'd probably put it under the search of students and their personal belongings
Sure.
section, just put a brief piece in there. I don't know if we need to be that redundant and, state the whole policy from metal detection, we can cross-reference it then, and then they can read further on if they want to, but, because it's also gonna be in the handbook also, looks like, right?
Correct.
So-
Yep, it'll go into the family handbook. It'll go in multiple places. So again, you're covered for the authority to do that. They're not going to policy for their guidance, they're going to their handbooks, they're going to those pieces, and there would be signage. So.
Yeah, so if we did add it, we would just be covered if we did,
mhm.
if we do eventually get something that
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
staff is using, so.
So why don't I just say we're not opposed, but we want to make sure we're in alignment, and what are their recommendations for that? Because again, we're certainly not the only ones looking at use of devices. And then our biggest one that there's some samples in is around animals in classrooms and on premises. And this is coming up quite a bit in our district because it's a differing interpretation of our current policy and practice. And where it's coming down to the wire. So animals generally in the past came into your schools in two ways. There were service animals, which have statutes, have all these other pieces associated with, and student services works through a whole plan if a student has or is bringing a service animal into part of their care. But then you also had some visits, right? So maybe the zoo's doing a program and there's gonna be a reptile exhibit, or we're doing something and there's a dog there as part of a show, that kind of thing. So that's where kind of the intention was. Since then, in those pieces, we've got therapy dogs that are coming because isn't it fun to, have one on site? And some schools have designated therapy dogs and they're part of student services and they do that. We do not have that, but you have some agencies wanting to bring in therapy dogs. And then principals were green lighting, because in there it gives the authority to the principal, green lighting a therapy dog, which then created a liability concern for us because they're in various stages of training and all of that. So we have a philosophical conversation at our cabinet level. So that's us looking at the intersection of service, liability, purpose, all of those things. So we would recommend that we further restrict some of those kind of therapeutic animals. No animal we don't think should be here while it's in training unless it's fully certified and doing anything like that. So that was a piece because, and we talked about others and how kids can and can't interact with them. So let's say the Humane Society came and they're gonna bring, a bunch of puppies and they're gonna do that. Well, can or can't your students interact with that animal because that's an untrained animal that could be biting someone, could be doing something like that. So we generally have had no interaction on those other things, so it really was, it became kind of philosophical and all of that. So eager for the team's thoughts on how we want to direct, but we do need to clean up current language to be very clear or drive that consideration up. Instead of at the principal level, they're going to have to check in because of the liability piece. Again, we've seen some green lights on some animals that are not actually fully certified, that are in training, and we would want to stop that at that level. But other than that, what would the board like to see?
Ken?
Why don't we adjust the policy to read, at a district level rather than at an administrative level.
Mhm.
And that way you can acquire legal counsel if needed or liability, mitigation. Just remove it from the individual school.
And then philosophically, because again, and this could be the larger board, do we have a stance on kind of that, not a service animal, but more of a therapy animal?
And when you
You're
say-
seeing therapy dogs.
And when you say therapy dog, one brought in at the behest or of a member of the school faculty or administration, or as it relates to, let's say, a counselor, a school employee counselor who,
Generally, it's been outside therapeutic agencies and bringing their animals in. So, again, we've been saying no because it's not fully certified, so those are easy to me. Like, we have to hold a line on a no there. But let's say I have an outside agency who does therapeutic services, they're fully trained animal, do we allow the animal on campus?
With permission, yeah.
yeah, so you're probably talking to the wrong person because I'm from the insurance world. But I'm going to assume for a moment that, let's assume that there are actual real, benefits to
Mhm.
therapy dogs, fully trained, fully, all that. So I want to be open about this. So the administration's thought is if it's not fully trained, definite no.
Yeah,
That's
that's
the thought.
easy to me.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, there's a measure of liability anytime you let any animal and your students engage or your staff engage with that animal in that way. So, there's other pieces, checks and balances we could look at. And we could do it short term, this is a one visit. There's also those pieces on notification, so we can make it a yes and
Right.
all of these things.
I do like the idea of, and not to put more on, the central office administration's plate, but the idea of perhaps we'll get a more consistent view if it comes there, if there's some sort of flow chart that says, first of all, not fully trained, not happening.
And I think we could do a couple checks and balances where it goes, and you've got the intersection of kind of the student services side as well as the operational side, because they're looking at different things. One's vetting, is the purpose on point, right? And is it the right, and then we're also looking at it through the liability lens, because I think we've been maybe not looking through multiple lenses when we're saying yes at that other level.
It's an interesting thought, because even at our company, gosh, I remember 5 years ago, there's a wildlife refuge rehabilitation center
Oh,
nearby.
sure.
And they brought in a bald eagle, and it was amazing.
The claws up.
Right, exactly. And so on the one hand, you'd say, wow, I can see how that would have great educational value. Right?
But there's a nuance of, so here's that, and maybe this is where our team does a little more work around understanding that, because, the nature center will bring in like the show with all the birds and all that kind of
Right.
stuff. But our students aren't engaging with that, they're watching that, another handler's doing it, and so maybe we really clean up some of those pieces. Again, we're just starting to see, I'd be looking on our website and following along on Facebook, and it's like, yeah, look at this dog that came in, or kids would send me a picture, like I had a bunch of high school kids send me a picture, like, look, we should have animals in schools. I'm like, that is an untrained animal, like, oh goodness. So I think maybe just a more consistent application and clean up of some of the things. Again, we had a really good, robust conversation at the cabinet level, so I could see us putting those in writing. We just didn't want to get out ahead of kind of what the board was thinking.
My general thought would be if you have these are clear, this is clear, no, but also here are the factors that you'd be looking at, but then ultimately it's in the discretion and determination of administration.
Right, and then we can clean it up to, and we've got some of the intersection of what we allow on property as well, because every now and then, especially if you're adjacent to a park, you'll have someone come do dog, walking and they're picking up their kids, and all of a sudden you've got a dog on property. And it's great and it's lovely, but however, one, you don't know the allergies, you don't know student fear, and we don't know control of the animal, so.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but this policy is 400 for students. So in my thoughts, I would think that this is referencing student animals, not
Right.
not licensed and insured, services that come in with animals for, mental health reasons or whatever. So, I mean,
I would
do
split
we
that out.
have students that bring in service animals?
We don't have any, service animals, no.
But I
They're
mean, we
working
couldn't
with one
restrict them
student.
if they were,
If it's a true service animal, so
Right.
here's how you restrict, so there's state statutes around service animals. You don't see them too often because you do require the child to be in control of the animal. And a lot of times, you're actually just giving them off-hours access when they're training, but they're not actually bringing their animal to school because they're not, they can't control it at that point. They're having to toilet the animal, they're having to, it's still learning. So, generally in some older cases, you might have a fully vetted, fully trained service animal, and we would work that out, and we would notice and do that. But when they're young and their animal is new to them, there are restrictions. There's a very certain series of questions that you work with the individuals on to determine if that meets those tests or not. But to your point, John, that's why I was like, I'm not sure if it's here or if it becomes more global at animals on school property, and then we lay out all the different kinds of animals and those pieces, that might be better served
I mean,
that way, to
with
your point.
that said, I still think the approval, even for a student animal, needs to be
It is,
at a higher level.
yeah. That's
Because it
service
is
animals.
under the principal right now.
Yeah. Perfect, then we're gonna shift that kind of responsibility and decision-making. I might mock something up that might actually end up in a different series and more comprehensively address kind of each part. So, again, because there's opportunities to learn, there's all those pieces, so I think we can come up with something for your review that would meet that. Thank you for that. And those were really the biggest ones that needed attention in this series. The rest, again, like I said, are up to date. And looking at that, the one piece that we might want to formalize, all of them have a 2023 review date, with the exception of 412.1 full-time students, which we have that. It's got a 2018 date. We might want to just formalize its review to update it on there. So we'll look at those pieces for that one on what constitutes full-time. But yeah, awesome. We're done.
Done?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Almost, all right.
So, yeah.
So we've reviewed the policies in the 400 series. Is there anything else then? Looks like we've reached the end of our planning
Yeah.
agenda. So we'll have some homework as these come back.
A little bit. A
Great.
little bit.
Anything else to come before the committee? Any objections to adjourning?
No.
All right, it is 4:40 PM and we'll consider ourselves adjourned. Thank you
Thank
everyone
you.
for attending.
John's in charge of the camera.
Excellent.